I'm Travis Proctor, Assistant Professor of Religion at Wittenberg University. Happy to be with you today. First, I want to thank the Ball State Philosophy and Religious Studies Department, especially Kevin Harrelson and Matthew Hotham for asking me to join you today. Thanks to all of you, the audience, for being here. I know there's a lot of other stuff going on in the world right now that maybe could have your attention, so I'm really honored that you join us. And also, at least where I am, it's a beautiful day out right now, so I'm really excited that you drop in and listen to what I have to say. So today I'll be talking about some of my research on ancient environmental collapse or environmental change and its aftermath, and some lessons that we can learn from that. So I'll go ahead and get started. Rising sea levels, increasingly destructive natural disasters, economic contraction, and just when you think you might need a drink to deal with it all, wine shortages. According to an overwhelming scientific consensus, if we do not curb global warming sufficiently, these are just a few of the societal calamities we will face, almost assuredly within the lifetimes of members of this audience. Some argue that those effects are already apparent. In response to an increasing concern with our environmental future, therefore, many commentators have turned for guidance to our ancient past. Recent articles from PBS, NPR, the Smithsonian Magazine, and Vanity Fair, to name just a few, have specifically examined the fall of ancient Rome, alleging that climate change or other environmental disasters were the primary factors in bringing down the once mighty ancient empire. Such articles have helpfully pointed out how we are not the first society to grapple with the collateral damage of environmental malpractice, with the attendant warning that even the strongest of societies, whether Roman or American, the implication goes, can fall prey to environmental devastation. Beyond serving as an historical harbinger, what lessons might ancient environmental collapse have for contemporary societies? To probe this question more deeply, today I'd like to share with you a selection from my recent research on ancient Ephesus, a Roman provincial city located in what is today Turkey, and which, like the empire of which it was a part, faced significant environmental challenges that helped to bring about its eventual demise. In the first part of my presentation, my overarching question will be, how did environmental challenges bring about late antique changes to the city of Ephesus? I'll provide an overview of the city's history, with a special focus on its environmentally induced contraction and downfall in late antiquity, roughly from the 3rd to the 11th centuries of the Common Era. Through this exploration, I hope to show how Ephesus' environmental challenges, many of which parallel our own, hold some important lessons for contemplating collective action and response. In the second part of my presentation, I'll ask, what cultural changes was Ephesus undergoing at this time? And how were these changes interconnected with concurrent environmental shifts? Here I'll demonstrate how environmental and cultural changes worked in tandem to alter the landscape and civic identity of ancient Ephesus, such that the city emerged from late antiquity in drastically altered form. I'll conclude the presentation with the query, what lessons might we be able to learn from this history for thinking about contemporary interactions of environmental challenges and cultural change? So first, Ephesus and its environments. Ephesus was an ancient Greek port city located on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea in Western Asia Minor in modern Turkey. The city traced its roots to Greek settlements of the 10th century BCE, before the Common Era, and became a flourishing center of commerce and culture under Greek and Roman rule. For many of you, Ephesus might be most familiar as one of the missionary stops of the Apostle Paul, or as one of the 7 churches addressed in the book of Revelation. For those of us who study the ancient world, however, Ephesus is also famous for its magnificent ruins shown here, which represent some of the best preserved examples of monumental architecture in the ancient world. The timeless solidity of such ruins, however, can at times be deceiving. Far from a durable and permanent civic center, Ephesus evolved continuously over its history and, as I'll explore in more detail shortly, in late antiquity experienced a gradual downfall. The earliest settlements near the city of Ephesus date to the 5th millennium BCE and were perched on the shore of the ancient Gulf of Ephesus, as you can see here marked by the orange X. A cultic sanctuary developed at this site in the 2nd millennium BCE, which served as the foundation for the eventual site of the famous Temple of Artemis. I'll talk about that some more later. The settlements around the temple remained the civic core of Ephesus for much of the city's early history. This began to change during the reign of the Greek king Lysimachus, who ruled from 294 to 281 BCE, who constructed new city walls in the areas of Mount Pion and Prion, 2 mountains to the southwest of the former city center, and transfer the local population to this newfound city. The new city is here located by the blue X, the old city by the orange. Lysimachus' civic reconfiguration was likely due to environmental considerations. Beginning around 6000 BCE, the sea level of the Mediterranean rose by around 100 meters. which prevented the nearby Cayster River from placing its silt out to sea. This material began to be deposited in the Gulf of Ephesus, leading to issues with flooding and the infilling of Ephesus harbors and bays. Lysimachus's new configuration, therefore, provided renewed access to a deep water harbor, contributing to the flourishing of the city as a center of commerce and culture for the next millennium. Over the long term, however, Lysimachus's solution proved to be only temporarily successful. The Cayster River continued to deposit silt in the Gulf of Ephesus, gradually moving the coastline further toward the Aegean Sea and jeopardizing the viability of Ephesus' deep water harbor. So here you can see the two city sites, the older and the newer, older by orange, newer by blue. And you can also see, if you look for the green kind of duck feet looking things, those are the coastlines that are progressively moving westward to the left on this graphic as time goes on, as more silt or dirt is deposited in the Gulf. And as you can see, they're slowly bypassing where the city is located, which is jeopardizing their access to the harbor or deep water. In addition to the rising sea levels, anthropogenic or human-caused factors also exacerbated Ephesus's problems with the siltation of its harbors. Intensive deforestation practices in the area, for example, accelerated surface runoff such that topsoil was washed away and deposited in the river valleys. In response, Ephesus's rulers and citizens expended great effort to hold the sediment at bay. The Hellenistic king Attalus II Philadelphos, who ruled from 159 to 138 BCE, for example, dredged the harbor to remove some of the accumulating silt and also installed a breakwater. Unfortunately, this likewise proved to be a temporary solution. The breakwater ultimately intensified the harbor's problems by hemming in the Cayster silt discharge, thus contributing to additional sediment accumulation. Ephesian citizens likely aggravated the problem further. The city diverted its sewage waste into the Great Harbor, and some citizens were using the harbor as an industrial waste dump. Toward the end of the 2nd century CE, the infilling of the harbor reached such an extent that the Ephesian politician and benefactor Titus Flavius Damianus constructed artificial islands at the mouth of the harbor so that ships could anchor there and transfer their cargo to the city. Damianus's desperate measure was a harbinger of things to come. The infilling of Ephesus's harbor only intensified in the late Roman and early Byzantine eras, from roughly the 3rd to the 7th century CE. Severe deforestation in the Roman period might be to blame for this. Climatic changes also may have intensified the issue. According to recent studies, late antique Ephesus experienced a cooler, drier climate that intensified issues with erosion and harbor infill. The combination of anthropogenic, oceanic, and climatic factors ultimately proved to be too great for Ephesians to overcome, eventually leading to the harbor's complete inaccessibility to large ships. This development, in turn, contributed to a major change in the city's civic landscape. Beginning in the late Roman and early Byzantine eras, the center of Ephesus began to shift away from its former centralized location between Mounts Pion and Prion toward a contracted and bifurcated city layout, split between two smaller cities, one centered on the lower harbor and theater, that'd be the kind of the red circular pattern to the left next to the harbor, and another on Iasilic Hill, which is in the top right of this graphic, which had formerly been outside the Roman city proper. The earlier walls here are indicated by green, so that'd be the old kind of civic configuration. The red line are the later bifurcated city borders. By the 9th century, after continued silting of the harbor and attacks from Arab invaders, the inhabitants of Ephesus consolidated their city on Iasilic here indicated by the red oblong area, which would remain the primary center for settlement in the area, up to the modern Turkish market town of Selçuk. Ephesus' late antique shift from flourishing harbor city to contracted inland settlement was certainly due to many factors, including lessening support from an increasingly unstable Roman government, repeated struggles with pandemics, economic contractions, and several destructive earthquakes. What remained at the base of Ephesus' late antique challenges, however, was its continued struggle to maintain the commercial viability of its deepwater harbor in the face of mounting environmental hazards, both anthropogenic and natural, such that by the medieval period, the former deepwater harbor was a landlocked lagoon. And you can see this here on the slide. So the former harbor is that circular looking lagoon that's in the foreground of the picture. The contemporary coastline you can of course see in the background. You can see the distance that is between those two sites. So that's how far the coastline has advanced since antiquity. In this sense, it would not be inaccurate to say that alongside its other challenges, Ephesus in late antiquity experienced an environmental collapse. This in turn brings us to the central question I'd like to ponder. What lessons might we learn from Ephesus' demise? Perhaps the most basic yet still significant is that human mistreatment of the environment has a lengthy history, stretching far back into our ancient past. This should caution us against viewing the pre-modern world as particularly eco-friendly, as some contemporary environmental thinkers are inclined to do. But perhaps even more importantly, we realize the equally lengthy history of attempts by humans to grapple with the fallout of the environmental risks they faced. The efforts of the Hellenistic rulers Lysimachus and Attalus II Philadelphos, as well as the Roman-era benefactor Damianus, showcase how humans often turn to their own ingenuity in the hopes of forestalling environmental disaster. And yet, in each of these cases, such efforts were only temporarily successful. Such cases prove that while humans often have the ability to adapt to and manage some of the environmental perils we face, if such adaptations are not accompanied by a concomitant change in the precipitating behavior, in the case of Ephesus, deforestation and irresponsible waste practices, the solution is likely to face long-term difficulties. And so, as contemporary commentators call for techno-fixes such as carbon capture to address global warming, the failure of Ephesus' attempts to save its harbor should give us pause. The Ephesians thought that their technological advancements and ingenuity could preserve their city in spite of their environmental malpractice. History warns us, however, that they are mistaken. Okay, so now for part two, talking about outside the city of Artemis, talking about the Acts of John and Ephesus. An altered physical environment was not the only change Ephesus faced in late antiquity. Just as Ephesus' landscapes were slowly transforming, so was its religious makeup. For nearly a millennium prior, Ephesus had been home to a rich variety of Greco-Roman polytheistic beliefs and practices, famous especially for its monumental temple of Artemis, 2 cultic sites dedicated to former Roman emperors, as well as several other shrines and temples. By the 4th or 5th century CE, however, Christianity had begun to take hold as a dominant force in the city. It would remain the major religious tradition in Ephesus up to the conquering of the city by Seljuk Turks in the 14th century. Thus, Ephesus' late antique environmental transformation and contraction took place alongside its concurrent Christianization, a major cultural change. With the remainder of my presentation, then, I ask, what cultural changes was Ephesus undergoing at this time? How are they interconnected with concurrent environmental shifts? In order to trace these interconnections, I turn to one of the earliest narratives of Christian activity within the city, the Acts of John. This collection of apocryphal tales, which dates to the 2nd or 3rd century, narrates the fantastical conversion of the city of Ephesus by the Apostle John, who, the Acts claims, wields the power of the Christian God to convert the masses, heal the sick, and destroy the city's famous polytheistic sites. While the Acts of John was eventually excluded from the Christian canon, it was initially a popular text among Christian readers, especially in Ephesus. As I will demonstrate, the Acts of John articulates Christian conceptions of space and civic borders that, combined with the environmental challenges the city was facing, led to a fundamental reshaping of Ephesus' civic landscape. I note, for example, that its narration of John's activity, the Acts shifts the cultic topography of Ephesus away from its famous Greco-Roman cultic sites and toward counter sites associated with Ephesian Christianity. This spatial rearranging is most evident in the Acts depiction of the apostles' supposed destruction of the famous Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and depicted here on the right in reconstructed form. On the left, you can see what remains of the temple, which is not much, just one reconstructed pillar. According to the Acts, the Apostle John approached the temple during a feast of dedication where participants were dressed in white. John arrived in black clothing, which provokes temple worshippers to seize John in order to kill him. John evades this seizure, ascends to a high platform, and prays to the Christian God to cleanse the city of the goddess Artemis. John's prayer results in the miraculous destruction of the monumental shrine. While some of the Ephesian crowd fled, many responded with proclamations of faith in the Christian God. From that point on, the Acts of John claim, Ephesus no longer belonged to Artemis, but to John. Scholars have long noted that the Acts depiction of the temple's demise and Christianity's origins in Ephesus is anachronistic or inaccurate. Archaeological reconstructions of the city of Ephesus show that the Temple of Artemis flourished well into the 3rd century, well after the lifetime of the early apostles, and most likely postdating the origins of the early Acts of John. The Acts depiction of the complete destruction of the temple alongside mass conversions of Ephesian citizens, then, does not square with the historical record. It's important to note here, however, that written texts in the ancient world served multiple functions beyond that of historical narrative, as guides for pilgrims, magical aids, archives of oral traditions, and inspirations for ritual life, to name just a few. Rather than dismissing the Acts for its apparent shortcomings in historical veracity, what might we discern by focusing on its inventive dimensions? That is, what the Acts constructs or imagines, and how such constructions become a part of the succeeding Christian cultures. Here, I'm particularly interested in how the Acts functions as a kind of cartography by constructing a new map of the civic spaces of Ephesus. A reorientation toward the production of cultural cartographies allows for fresh insight into the significance of the Temple of Artemis's demise in the Acts. In both geographical and spatial terms, the Artemis had resided at the core of Ephesian cultic space and civic identity since time immemorial. During important festivals, including the biannual celebrations dedicated to Artemis, Ephesians gathered in the public precincts of the temple to prepare for the cultic procession. And here the temple is shown here on the right of the graphic. The assembly proceeded from the temple to the city proper down towards the bottom of this graphic through the Magnesian Gate, traveled through the central city streets, and exited through the Caressing Gate towards the top of this graphic, and returned to the temple. At the end of the procession, festival participants gathered in the temple banqueting hall for a communal meal. Through this process, the processions created what Susan Alcock refers to as a topography of remembrance, a landscape imbued with meaning as produced by the important rites performed within its environs. The processional way in the Temple of Artemis played a vibrant role, therefore, in constructing the religious map of Ephesus, both real and imagined. Through John's destruction of the Temple of Artemis, the Acts of John effectively disassembles the cultic map of Ephesus by dislocating its spatial axis. The Acts underscores the spatial and performative implications of this act by depicting John's disassembling as occurring during an important festival procession. As noted previously, the Acts claims that the apostle confronted the Ephesian crowd while they were dressed in white and gathered at the Artemision. The white attire of the congregants suggested they are assembling for one of the Ephesian festivals dedicated to Artemis, which the Acts identifies as a feast of dedication. When John interrupts this gathering and destroys the temple, he not only undercuts the worship of Artemis, therefore, he undermines a festival procession that was a dynamic force in the shaping of the city's cultic cartography or map. There are indications elsewhere that the destruction of the Temple of Artemis is just one part of a more wide-ranging emphasis on non-civic sites as gathering places for Christian groups in the Acts of John. This can be seen most clearly in the Acts' repeated narration of events that occur outside the city of Ephesus. John's first miracle in relation to the city, for example, a resurrection of the city's chief citizen, Lycomedes, and his wife, Cleopatra, not that Cleopatra, occurs after he meets with Lycomedes outside the city gates. Similarly, later in the narrative, the Acts notes that John, quote, had a dream instructing him to walk 3 miles beyond the city gates. John obeys the directive and encounters a young man who had just inadvertently killed his father. John resurrects the boy's father and converts both the father and son as they walk back toward the city gates. The Acts' consistent emphasis on John's miracle working and community building outside the city likely functions to highlight the apostles' dissociation from the sacred civic landscape of Ephesus. The typical Roman city, such as Ephesus, was often understood to be a network of holy places, bounded by a sacred border or pomerium. Christianity, however, was one of the many unofficial religious groups that, at least in this period, did not gain approval from Roman religious officials to operate within the sacred bounds of the city. As a result, Christians did not typically meet in public cultic settings, but in ad hoc or domestic spaces. The sacred status of the Roman city and Christianity's historical exclusion from that landscape highlights how the Acts' placement of many of John's activities outside the city gates implicitly positions the Christian community as an extra-urban religious group, disassociated from the traditional cultic geography of Ephesus. A closer look at the Acts' spatial rearranging provides a clue to the importance of extra-urban spaces. It's significant, for example, that the Acts depicts the Christian community under John's leadership as gathering and performing a sacred ritual meal at the suburban tomb of a fellow Christian who had recently passed. Such a practice accords well with ancient familial practices surrounding tombs. During important festivals and on the birthday of the deceased, ancient Greco-Roman families often gathered at the tomb and celebrated the loved one with a ceremonial meal. Thus, the Acts of John depicts Christian believers as a kind of alternative family who gather at the tombs of their departed to celebrate their lives and renew their bonds of kinship. Significantly, most tombs in the ancient Mediterranean were placed outside the city due to associations between death and pollution. Thus, the Acts' centralization of tomb cult to Christian identity likely informs its broader emphasis on activities taking place outside the city. We can see this association likewise in the final instance of John's activities outside the city, which occur in connection with his death and burial. Near the end of his Ephesian mission, John collected his followers and gave them a final sermon. John thereafter abruptly instructs a group of followers to follow him to a location, quote, beyond the city gates. There, John's followers dig a deep trench into which the apostle entered and died peacefully. As noted already, John's burial outside the city accords with the ancient Greek and Roman practice of burying the dead in suburban areas. Early Christian saint and martyr cults followed suit, including the tomb historically associated with John in Ephesus, which was located on Isolate Hill. It's possible that the early authors or editors of the Acts drew upon this tradition in narrating John's death and interment. Nevertheless, when placed in the literary context of the Acts of John, John's extra-urban entombment amplifies the text's overall emphasis on the importance of extra-urban spaces and provides a narrative framing for John's activities. Both the beginning and end of John's Ephesian mission occur outside the city gates. Through both its destruction of Greco-Roman religious sites and centralization of extra-urban spaces for Christian worship, the Acts of John encourages its readers, perhaps citizens or visitors to Ephesus, to come to see the city differently. Instead of valorizing the famous temple of Artemis, the Acts guides its readers to the tomb of John. Instead of investing significance in Ephesus' sacred circuit of polytheistic sites, the text escorts its readers to the margins of the city, where they might celebrate with their Christian kin the very special family members that had preceded them in death. In this way, the Acts guides its readers through a new map of Ephesus with new sacred sites and circuits where they can learn to become kin with the famous apostle. Okay, now for some concluding remarks. My literary analysis of the Acts of John suggests that just as the city of Ephesus was facing significant environmental challenges to its harbor, and thus to the traditional topography of its civic core, an important religious subgroup within its city was articulating an alternative cultural valuation of the city and its religious landscapes. In the 2nd century, when the Acts of John were first recorded, this was likely inconsequential. Christians were a negligible minority in the Roman Empire at this time, with no real political power in cities such as Ephesus. Over the next 2 centuries, however, as Christianity gained a foothold in the city and across the Mediterranean, such alternative understandings will have had consequences for how Ephesians viewed and interacted with their local landscapes. We can see the impact of such a shift, in fact, in the emergence of Hagia Sophia as a new city center in late antique Ephesus. And here's a slide again of the old and new civic borders, the older borders in green, the new civic borders bifurcated between these 2 areas in red. As noted previously, the Acts of John narrates that the Apostle John was buried outside the city of Ephesus and otherwise emphasizes the importance of extra-urban spaces to John's legendary founding of Christianity in the city. Notably, literary and archaeological sources attest to the existence of a gravesite associated with John on Hagia Sophia Hill, circled here in red at the top right. As I noted just a few minutes ago, the site would have been located outside the city proper when the Acts of John were first written, compiled, and retold, thus suggesting a potential relationship between the Acts of John narrative and local Ephesian traditions. There existed from an early period a small square martyrium on the site of the tomb, which was later replaced with a large cruciform basilica. This smaller church was later supplanted by an even larger basilica built on the directive of the Emperor Justinian. The site and basilica, the ruins of which shown here, became one of the most popular pilgrimage destinations in the Mediterranean basin, famous for the miraculous dust that purportedly emanated from John's tomb. Eventually, an aqueduct was built in order to serve fresh water to the site, which then became an important resource for the development of the Hagia Sophia settlement. Due to both its local significance and its economic impact then, it's perhaps no surprise that the Ephesians would increasingly center their settlement on this area and protect it with late antique fortifications. When contextualized against this cultural backdrop, we come to see how the changing landscapes of late antique Ephesus, shown here in the slide, were not only the result of significant environmental factors, but the consequence of a complex mix of cultural, social, and environmental dynamics. A silting harbor may have pushed Ephesians inland, but it was the valorization of John's tomb and basilica that positioned Hagia Sophia as the new city center of Ephesus, and thus gave shape to a distinctive iteration of late antique and medieval Ephesus. Viewed retrospectively then, the Acts valorization of extra-urban space, including the legendary tomb of John, likely served as an important cultural resource for Ephesians as they grappled with and adapted to the increasing environmental insolvency of their old city center. Whereas Greco-Roman polytheistic cults were centralized within the disintegrating urban core of Ephesus, the emergent Christian movement aligned its sacred landscape to the extra-urban tomb of John, located outside the city on Hagia Sophia, and was thus insulated from the environmental and architectural challenges facing sites in the Roman city center. Thus, environmental forces had disproportionate negative impacts on Greco-Roman cultural traditions, thus perhaps hastening their demise. I should stress that I'm not arguing here that Christianity was perhaps more environmentally friendly, nor that it was superior in some way to the Greco-Roman traditions in how it handled such issues, but simply that for various reasons, environmental change had disproportionate impacts on Ephesus' cityscape, and thus on the religious traditions that were connected to particular parts of the city. In such a way, we can begin to see how environmental and religious changes in late antique Ephesus were interinformative. The intricate interconnection of environment and culture can help us reflect on what lessons we might draw from ancient environmental challenges and collapse. Toward this end, it's helpful to return to those headlines with which my presentation began, namely regarding the fall of Rome. The case of Ephesus does affirm the general message such stories wish to transmit. Environmental history teaches us that we must be careful in our treatment of the environment, lest we face the risk of losing those institutions and cultural traditions we hold most dear. The demise of Ephesus' millennia-long polytheistic traditions and the splintering of its government and other institutions exemplifies this point. Yet, the case of Ephesus teaches us that such consequences, when they appear, will be the result of a complex mix of forces, both environmental and cultural. This insight pushes us to be wary of environmental determinism, an approach which views the natural world as an isolated system or sole cause of social change, and which has operated as the underlying assumption of many recent treatments of ancient environmental history, including many of those stories that I shared their headlines of. The case of Ephesus, however, evidences a more complex causative pattern, one of entangled strands of both human and non-human action. As we forecast our own societal futures, therefore, we'll have to account for such multifaceted relationships. As a final point, Ephesus reminds us that human-induced environmental hazards, such as global warming, as well as issues with flooding or infilling of former waterways, pose threats not only to our physical environments, but also to our most treasured cultural traditions. Such challenges often take the form, however, not of a sudden and apocalyptic collapse, as our films and TV shows often imagine, but through the slow violence that asymmetric environmental exposure does to specific communities, peoples, and non-human animals. This should encourage us to think of the challenges posed by global warming and other environmental risks, not only in terms of their global impact of global environmental risk, but also with regard to the specific challenges that certain communities and peoples will disproportionately face as their local environments encounter environmental change and hazard. Here we might turn to the insights drawn from research on environmental racism, for example, to help better understand the environmental risks posed especially to underprivileged communities. We might ask then, what treasured cultures, communities, and animals might we lose if we stay on our current path? What people and communities will be disproportionately impacted by such losses? The case of Ephesus, therefore, reminds us that while environmental challenges to human societies have an ancient history, they carry specific and unequal risks to our natural environments and communities that are all too present. Thank you. So I think now we have some time for questions, is that right?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Travis.
Yeah, thanks.
I suppose we'll leave it open. A number of students have joined us here, so we'll give them first priority. Let's just say if any of you wish to ask a question, use the hand raise button.
I'll take it back to my favorite slide of this, which is the modern harbor.
Wow, it's very beautiful. Have you been? Let me just ask you a few personal questions about the research. Tell us a little bit about how you came about this. Have you visited Ephesus? What kinds of research have you done on the ground here, such that you've reconstructed such a vast period of the city's history?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I think I'll start with where I first got interested in this. This might be of interest if any students took Joe Marshall's classes on the Bible or on Paul's letters. I first got interested actually in thinking about Paul when it comes to Ephesus. So the Acts of John is one of our earliest accounts of early Christian history in Ephesus. But oddly, it doesn't mention the figure that almost is always associated with Ephesus, which is Paul. Of course, as many of you will know, Paul supposedly visited Ephesus according to Acts. There's a letter from Paul, maybe not from Paul, but associated with Ephesus at least. And yet the Acts of John never mentions Paul, despite telling of the missionary work of the city when Paul would have been alive. So that just first got me. It was a really kind of odd instance in Christian literature. And so my first research was actually looking at how this text thinks about different apostles and how it constructs this kind of history of the city. But then as I did research on the city, just to learn more about its history, I kind of recognized this really interesting environmental change, this major civic shift that's connected to the environment that's also going on at the same exact time that the city is slowly, gradually becoming a Christianized city. And it really got me thinking about, I already had interest in the environmental history. So I wanted to think some more about how could these be intertwined? How could they be informing each other? And so that's what eventually got me down on this path of thinking more about environmental change and cultural change with the city of Ephesus. And I have been there. I was able to get a research grant to visit there. It's been a while now. It's back in 2013 that I was able to visit. But the Austrian archaeological team, whose research I rely on heavily for all of this, they're really gracious and showed me around and showed me all the sites that they're digging and the new insights they're having. So that's really important. A lot of the research that goes into the paper, a lot of it's brand new within the last decade or so, because there's kind of a vibrant archaeological research scene there. And so it can be a challenge actually, because it gets updated fairly frequently of what we know about the late antique history of the city. So, but yeah, so I've been able to see the site and kind of see those changes, and it is really, it's really interesting because if you know the ancient history of the city, you know that it's this kind of famous, flourishing harbor city, but you're nowhere near the sea. I mean, you're near it, but you're not on the precipice of the Mediterranean Sea as the city would have been. And so that kind of spurred me further to think about how those changes took place and how they interacted with other changes.
Yeah, so if I might follow up a little bit, walk us back through. I mean, you made the point pretty quickly that Christians in second century Ephesus were let me call them suburban or extra urban group who moved due to the environmental changes to becoming, or due partly to the environmental changes, became more of an urban group. So walk us through exactly how that happened, if you might fill that in a little bit for us.
Yeah, that's a great question. So early in Christian movements, they would have been mostly excluded from that kind of sacred landscape. So I think this is something that's really different from how we often think of religion in the modern world, at least contemporary world, of thinking of religion as more of in the private sphere. In the ancient Greco-Roman world, at least, it was very much a public entity.
Right.
And typically your cultic sites were centralized in these very urban spaces, and were designed to be very public spaces. However, since Christianity was this marginal group that had a rocky relationship with Roman rulers and other Roman citizens, because of that, they are mostly excluded from that landscape. We don't have purpose-built Christian buildings until the 3rd century. So for the first 250, 300 years of the movement. So at first, Christians almost exclusively would have met in the homes of other Christians, usually some kind of wealthy patron, perhaps. Or we have this other evidence, including in the Acts of John, for Christians conducting meeting spaces at tombs, either the tombs perhaps of deceased Christians, or eventually at the tombs of people that they'd eventually would call saints, of kind of sanctified people that they saw as particularly important. And so that's what pushes them at first to be this suburban community, is that the main spaces they're meeting in aren't really central public spaces, but either private spaces in the home or suburban tomb spaces. That does begin to change, however, with kind of changing practices, not necessarily just in Ephesus, but eventually Christians start to take on a kind of different relationship with tombs, such that they start actually building settlements around cemeteries and graveyards, such that in late antiquity, oftentimes the kind of pattern of settlement for Christians is that it will be kind of a church with a cemetery attached to it, and then the settlement built around it. So instead of in the Greco-Roman world, where cemeteries were always suburban, they're always extra urban outside the city walls, Christians actually started centering their city around tombs. So at that point, the tomb and those sites become kind of intra-urban sites. And that's the development that takes place over late antiquity, both in Ephesus, as Iasilic Hill becomes one of these types of settlements, but also in other cities as well. We start to see that development. So that shift starts to happen in late antiquity.
Excellent. So I know this is a little bit of a tangential point you just made, but I wanna know more about this. Why the emphasis on cemeteries, and explain a little better, if you can, like why this is an exceptional thing in the ancient world. The only reason why that struck me is I think of like the Egyptians building massive tombs.
Right. Yeah.
And I think of cemetery as one of the major foci of ancient religion. But I think Christianity is distinct in this a little bit, at least in the landscape of Greco-Roman geography.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think what I would say is, maybe to qualify my own point, is that Christians weren't distinctive in having what we call cultic religious practices around tombs. Other non-Christian Greco-Romans were doing that all the time. That was a regular part. If you had a deceased family member, you almost always would. It was expected that on their birthday or on the day that they passed away, you'd go have like a family meal at their tomb.
Okay.
You kind of celebrate them. So it was kind of a regular practice for Greco-Romans to do that. Christians seem to take this up, but instead of celebrating it with what we think of as like their natural family, they started to make their own, what we call a religious community, into kind of like an alternative family. And
Right.
maybe they did this out of necessity. Maybe it's because it's kind of the one religious practice that was kind of open to them, because they weren't going to go to the local temple. So maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's just some kind of adaptation they're making, because we do have a kind of a strong strand in early Christianity of Christians thinking of themselves as a family. And so maybe that idea of them being a family made the tomb a central place where they wanted to gather, because that's what families do. So it's hard to know exactly where it began, but it's fairly widespread. We find it in a fair amount of our early literature that Christians are talking about themselves as a family and mentioning tombs as a place where they might meet. And those things seem to be connected up in some way.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I want to walk you back to some of the big questions, but in order to do so, I'm going to ask you for another tangential point. Because the headlines, if you can go to the headlines, that the NPR and
yeah, here we go.
Yeah, so here, the Smithsonian headline says how climate change and plague helped bring down the Roman Empire. So we're in a pandemic, and like a lot of people in the pandemic, I started studying history of plague only after the pandemic came in, and I was amazed to learn how common the experience of pandemic shutdown or epidemic shutdown has been in societies in the past. And it's just one of these things I must have missed as a kid, like the role of disease and as a driver of history. And all in the back throughout the pandemic, I've had this idea of climate change in the back of my head, saying like these are kind of parallel phenomena. Sometimes related, maybe, but they're parallel phenomena, parallel extra-human phenomena that are constantly impacting the way humans behave. So tell us a little bit about plague and its relationship to climate change, if there is one in ancient Ephesus. If there are there health concerns also that come along with this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think where that kind of headline comes from is that it's fairly recent research that many scholars of antiquity and of ancient Rome especially have pointed to the prevalence of pandemics of disease right around the time when the Roman Empire seems to be kind of weakening and eventually splitting up and eventually kind of collapsing from its former glory. And so many scholars have posited that these pandemics and various waves, including one of the emperors I mentioned, Justinian, who helped build the Basilica of John. One of the plagues is, unfortunately for him, named after him, the Justinianic Plague, which is one of the worst ones that the ancient Mediterranean saw. But they certainly are related. Many scholars think that they're in some way related to kind of the weakening fortunes of the Roman Empire. For the most part, it's seen as kind of a parallel, let's say, non-human, environmental-ish development, that while the Roman Empire is facing some major climatic changes, and I just mentioned that quickly for Ephesus, the major argument is that the Mediterranean at the time, in this late antiquity, at this time when the Roman Empire is experiencing lessening fortunes, at the same time they're experiencing a different climate, a changing climate, at least based on how we can reconstruct it, including a drier and a colder climate, which was the reason why this is a big problem for them. Is that basically they can't grow as much food as they used to. The kind of available land for growing food is no longer there. Of course, when you're trying to support an empire that grew in population by quite a bit, it's really hard to do if you all of a sudden can't grow as much food as you could a century ago. So as that's happening, they also are struggling with things like pandemics. They do think, I think in some ways where you might see climate change and pandemic related could be that as climate change happens, you see populations more on the move as certain areas become less viable for populations. More people are on the move. That could lead to a bigger spread. If there's a disease in one community and that community moves, that could lead to a higher spread. But in general, one thing that scholars often cite with this is that just in general, the increased interconnectivity of the Roman Empire. All the roads lead to Rome is something that, even that Rome is famous for. Well, that's because the empire built this infrastructure to really make sure that its different provinces were interconnected to benefit both its military, of course, but also its economy. But that also means that things like disease travel fairly well. If humans can travel well and if animals can travel well,
Yes.
disease can too. And so that was the big connection that many historians draw. Of course, you can immediately see how that's applicable to our own world. In an increasingly globalized economy, with worldwide travel increasingly easy, or easier at least, you can see where that parallel really kind of strikes home for us. So that's where I think the ancient world can kind of be a parallel for thinking about our own challenges that we're facing.
Yeah. No, I mean, fascinating answer. Thank you so much for that. Now, so since you want to apply this to the contemporary scene, let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, first of all, let's just talk about religion. How do we look at environmental impacts on religion if one of the big outputs of your talk is that, at least in Ephesus, this fringe cult on the borders of the city becomes more prominent, more centralized, partly as a result of environmental change. What does that fact tell us about our society?
Yeah, I think the big kind of framing that I often try to think of this as, where, thinking about religion and the environment, of course, is a major place of research right now. And I talk about with my students, I teach a class on religion, nature, and the environment. A lot of the literature that's come out of that field is typically looking at how have religious attitudes or practices shaped environmental practice, which is, of course, very important. And that's a really interesting. So say, how have Christian societies or Islamic majority societies, how have they treated the environment? How have ideas from their religions impacted the way that they thought about the environment or treated it? So my research is actually trying to do the opposite of how have environmental changes, which of course are kind of intersecting with human action, but how do those actually have impacts on religious practice? Or how can they have impacts on the way religious communities look? And in this case, the way in which environmental changes, at least in this landscape, impacted a city in what I'm calling kind of unequal ways, that certain parts of the city became less and less viable as population centers. Other parts of the city became more and more attractive as population centers. Those had unequal impacts. The place where Greco-Roman religious sites were centralized increasingly became the place where humans probably didn't want to build a city or have a city. Whereas the site where Christian religious activity was centralized increasingly became an advantageous place. And so no matter what ideas these religious groups had about the environment, whatever those might be, the environment was still kind of there impacting the way that they could or couldn't conduct their religious practices. So for me, it's just, I think, trying to kind of reframe the question of how religion and environment are related, and trying to think of how, if environmental change, in this case collapse, has kind of unequal impacts, or let's just say differential impacts on culture, then what's that going to mean for our religious communities? How's it going to impact the way people can or can't carry out their religious identities? So that's where I even, my case studies, of course, in the ancient world, still think that might be an interesting question to think about for contemporary environmental change, collapse, or impact.
Can I jump in on that, Travis? Can you hear
me?
Yeah. That's interesting to me, and that's one of the questions I had, which was thinking about taking this research and applying it to the present, because often when we talk about the relationship between religion and the environment, particularly Christianity and the environment in the contemporary context, it's seeing Christianity, certain articulations of Christianity, as a barrier to taking climate action. And there's a sense that the kind of environmental classes that you would teach religion and environment classes, the purpose of them is to sort of recover some environmental stewardship model within this tradition, right? But if we take your research seriously, that environments shape religion as much as, or maybe more than vice versa, I wonder how the quote-unquote of Christianity, such that moving into the 21st century, more and more Christians are going to be, the majority of Christians are going to be located in the global south and actually experiencing directly the impacts of climate change, and if that might drive a reevaluation of Christian views towards climate change, more so than digging deep into theology and trying to get sort of Western white Christians to change their view. Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, it might just be on my end, but your question broke out, but I think I got the kind of main part of it, Matt. And so that's a really interesting point, or a really good point you make there about kind of increasing centralization, or at least prominence of, say, Christians in the global South. And as Christians face more and more kind of environmental challenges across the globe, that might kind of change this kind of conversation. I think that's right. I think it really will change this conversation because, as you've pointed out, so often the conversation on religion and the environment has been how have certain models of Christianity, in this case Christianity, but of course this has been elsewhere too, but how have Christianity promoted or not promoted positive environmental practices, environmental stewardship, and then oftentimes focused on those movements that are kind of most notorious for maybe not doing so. But I think as we start to see that these things are going to have cultural impacts, then I think it might kind of change the question of, like, it's not just about what religious groups say about it, but it's also about that all cultural institutions are going to have to face kind of these challenges in some way. The example I often think about, we think about, for example, Louisiana and the Bayou kind of being this kind of heavily exposed region to environmental change and rising sea levels, et cetera, et cetera. So I think about the very kind of unique, especially say modes of like Catholic piety that are located there. So that might just be one example of, as an area is increasingly threatened by environmental risk or hazard, how do kind of maybe the unique modes of religious piety and identity that they have, they're also under threat. And so I think that's that's kind of where I could see at least one contemporary case study of that happening in an American context, at least.
And then my other question, which is maybe related to this, but projecting back onto this time period, some of our maybe contemporary presuppositions about religiosity and the environment. Obviously there were technological interventions to attempt to stave off this environmental change. Do you see evidence that there was a recognition that some of this was human caused, or was there no recognition of this? And then if there was no recognition or limited recognition that there was a human cause of these changes, was there anybody who felt that this was some sort of divine judgment, or that this was something that shouldn't be technologically fixed because that was inappropriate, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think a few responses on that. We do have evidence for at least some ancient thinkers being aware of the natural kind of mechanisms of what was causing this. So Ephesus is actually cited as an example of siltation causing landlocking. So there's actually, when the Gulf of Ephesus was still there was an island there, but now it's just a hill in the middle of other land, So an ancient author mentions this, that, hey, there used to be this island in the Gulf of Ephesus, now it's just a hill. So, and he notes that, like, well, it's because this river is dumping so much silt into the bay, and it's just, he doesn't use our terminology, but says, basically the coastline is moving. So there's recognition of that. But then to answer your more specific question, there's no evidence for recognition of human causes of this. So the ones that contemporary kind of environmental historians would point to in the case of Ephesus, as I said, deforestation, also animal husbandry. In the case of Ephesus, especially the raising of goats, which apparently are really bad at removing foliage, which then leads to more runoff and more siltation deposits. It doesn't seem like they recognize those factors. There were some critiques of deforestation in the ancient world, but not then connected to like the collateral damage, if that makes sense. To answer your second kind of set of questions, was this recognized as divine judgment? With regard to the plague, yes, absolutely. I don't know of any with regard to, say, the harbor, those kind of environmental changes or challenges. But with regard to things like the plague, yes. Obviously, folks familiar with ancient Greco-Roman polytheism know that gods were often kind of assigned to or associated with certain natural things like rivers or the sky or what have you. And so in those cases, in the case of certain Greco-Roman communities, we do know of examples. So this actually, I didn't include it because it doesn't happen with regard to Ephesus, but a city nearby Ephesus, Aphrodisias, actually, we have an example of a story told where they actually conducted like a special ritual ceremony with the goddess Artemis because they're facing this plague. They're like, we must have made Artemis really mad. Like something must have happened. We got to do something different. And so they do a special ritual ceremony to try to please her. So yes, there does seem to be some idea of divine judgment, but I don't know that I don't know if anybody's kind of saying we shouldn't intervene with like the harbor because the gods will just kind of take care of it. We haven't really seen something like, I don't know of anything quite like that. They seem to have, yeah, they seem to kind of have, they obviously recognized the problem and then of course intervened with their technological fixes. But they did resort sometimes to religious activities, what we'd call religious activities, to try to address these issues.
Thanks, that was great.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Well, Travis, I, for one, am very impressed by this presentation. I feel like I learned a lot. I appreciate you taking the time out here in these difficult conditions here in the middle of the pandemic from a distance, and then on this crazy election week, taking the time to educate us about ancient Ephesia. You're getting a bunch of thank yous from the students who are on.
Yeah, thank you.
Who are on the call. Man, I think we should go unlive now if we're capable of doing that. Joe, can you take us offline?
Are we all finished with our discussions?
It looks like it.
All right, well then let me take the time to just thank everybody for attending. Thank you to Travis Proctor from joining us all the way to perform this series of discussions with us. And for those watching off of our Facebook page, please keep tuned in to both our Facebook website as well as our main website, www.munciepubliclibrary.org. And you will hear future mentions of big questions, big ideas when we get the next one up. Thank you very much for attending, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. This was really great.